Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Elaine Oliphant. I'm an assistant professor here in religious studies and anthropology at NYU, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our, I believe, 8th annual Lerner Workshop in Religion and Society. This event is made possible by a generous donation made by the Lerner family a number of years ago. Each year, a renowned scholar is invited to give a distinguished lecture. Past speakers have included Professor Jeffrey Stout, also of Princeton, Professor Catherine Lofton from Yale, and Professor Joseph Soret of Columbia University. Speakers address issues that correspond with the religious studies program's ongoing mission to explore religious practice and belief as integral parts of human social life. A central part of our intellectual mission is to create public contexts for the kind of conversations about religion and social life that usually only occur in the academy. Just as religion is something fundamentally public, so the conversation about it should be as well. As our wide interdisciplinary approach includes anthropological, historical, literary, and philosophical approaches to the study of religion, so the invited speaker is invited to think big about the given topic. This year, we are honored to have Professor Judith Weisenfeld, the Agate Brown, and George L. Collard Professor of Religion at Princeton University to present her latest work on American religious history. Here to introduce Professor Weisenfeld is our Faculty Fellow in Religious Studies, Dr. Xavier Pickett.
As you all know, our lecturer for this evening is Dr. Judith Weisenfeld. As you just heard into our hearing, the Agate Brown and George Collard Professor of Religion, an Associate Faculty in the Department of African American Studies and Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her research spans the gamut of religion, race, gender, migration studies, FEM, American studies, just to name a few. And that spanning of that gamut takes place in many sort of field-defining ways. Her first book, African American Women and Christian Activism, New York's Black YWCA, 1905-1945, published by Harvard University Press, examines middle-class Black women who were committed both to social action and to institutional expression of their religious convictions. Her second book, which I love the title, by the way, Hollywood Be Thy Name, African American Religion and American Femme. I never asked you whether or not were you the source of that title. That's pay me no mind, but only just to indulge me. The rest of the introduction you can figure about me once I sit down. And so this particular text, her second book, is the first book really to examine how Femme constructed images of African American religion. It explores the cinematic express representations of how they reflected and contributed to complicated discourse about race and the social and the moral requirements of American citizenship and the very nature of American identity. And commenting on the intellectual facility of Dr. Weisenfeld, one reviewer writes, Weisenfeld is a professor of religion, but Hollywood Be Thy Name proves amply that she is a first-rate sentiment scholar at home, both when working as a cultural historian and when working as a textual interpreter. In her most recent work, New World Coming, Black Religion and Racial Identity During the Great Migration, it really lays bare how new Black religious movement constructed what she calls a religio-racial identity in innovative ways, and how these new-made identities shape their conceptions of the bodies, families, and religious and social communities, space and place, and political sensibilities. I would like to echo the sentiments of another reviewer who says that her latest work, quote, will likely become a definitive account of the early phase of religio-racial movements. Her meticulous research into the background of various participants, tracing their origins, is a model of historical scholarship that takes seriously the agency and individuality of historical subjects. You know, on a brief personal note, while I've been a part of kind of the Princeton community between both the seminary and university, the impact of the intellectual community has been invaluable for me as a person and as an academic. You know, there really are few people, I don't want to get myself into too much trouble, at Princeton and really in the academy broadly, who really combine the type of wicked smarts and generosity and humility more than Dr. Weisenfeld. And so you guys are in for a treat, not just because of her mind, but also because of her person and what she stands for. And so the talk that you will be presented today is on the spiritual madness, as you see, race, psychiatry, and African American religions. It is the most privilege and honor that I have to welcome to the podium Dr. Judith Weisenfeld.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Xavier, for that really generous introduction, and Elaine for the invitation. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I know so many people in this program, and it's really great to be among friends, and especially Angela Zito, who knows me from when I was practically a child. So, and that's true. She was a child too, and has been such a great colleague and supporter over the years. So I'm really excited to present some early thoughts on a project that's just underway and to get some feedback from you on it. The urgency is unmistakable in Pinckney P. Royal's letter to the superintendent of the Central Lunatic Asylum for Negro Insane in Petersburg, Virginia, as is his concern for his oldest son, George. At 47, Pinckney and his wife, Lucy, lived with their 5 children, and they had worked hard to establish themselves and provide for their children's future in the years following the Civil War and their emancipation from slavery. In freedom, Pinckney worked first as a farm laborer and then as a carpenter, and within a few years, he owned the land on which the family's home sat. They had both become literate, managed to send all their children to school, and saw their oldest child, George, become a school teacher in one of the county's small, impoverished schools for Black children. When Pinckney wrote to the asylum superintendent in July of 1885, he appealed for the institution to send for George, concluding the letter, "Let me hear from you as soon as possible, as we are in great distress." Just a few days earlier, George had been brought before a panel of 3 justices of the peace in Halifax County because he was, quote, suspected of lunacy, end quote. At the time the hearing was ordered, George was being restrained at home in bed, so it's possible that his father was the one who had instigated the hearing. Samuel Hales, a local white doctor, testified about George's condition, providing information from his own observation and incorporating insights from Pinckney's assessment. George had begun to show symptoms of insanity at the end of June when he became violent towards those around him and displayed what the doctor called a redundancy of disconnected ideas rapidly expressed. And George was fixated on 2 things in his manic expressions, according to Hales: that he was, quote, a regular lawyer, end quote, and, quote, a favorite with God under Ingersoll, end quote. And these were probably related, as Robert Ingersoll, the well-known and much reviled freethinker, was a lawyer who railed against religion in his speeches. In an 1881 address titled "Some Reasons Why," Ingersoll criticized Christians who he contended hate others in the name of universal benevolence, but who preach love but engage in war and do not respect the rights of others. Whoever imagines himself a favorite with God, Ingersoll proclaimed, holds other people in contempt. While we know nothing more of George Royal's emotional and mental conflicts than what the clerk recorded during the hearing, it is possible that he was experiencing religious doubts. Hales also reported on behalf of Pinckney that George was anxious about lectures he had been asked to deliver. I can relate to that. And the doctor felt that the cause of the mental illness was, quote, over mental excitement because of preparation for the lectures. George was finally admitted to the asylum in September of 1885, just 6 months after a large new facility had opened and 2 months after the court declared him, in its official language for such proceedings, a lunatic and a citizen of this state, and directed that he be confined there. In the first address on the topic of insanity among people of African descent in the United States before the members of the National Conference of Charities and Correction, Dr. James Woods Babcock, a Presbyterian and superintendent of the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane in Columbia, sounded an alarm. Babcock informed his fellow white physicians and social welfare workers that since the end of slavery, the incidence of insanity in this population had increased rapidly and was placing great stress on the ability of institutions to deal with, quote, this constant accumulation of lunatics, end quote. Citing federal census data, he charted a national increase from 175 colored insane per million inhabitants in 1850 to 886 per million in 1890. And he informed that while the reported proportion of insane people of African descent was far higher in northern states in 1890, the increasing number in the South was striking. Babcock reported, quote, in Virginia, it has been claimed the increase of insanity in the colored race has been for 25 years at the rate of 100 or more % every 10 years, end quote. And Virginia, where George Royal was institutionalized, may have presented the extreme case in his survey, but it was not alone. M.L. Perry, a pathologist at the Georgia State Sanitarium in Milledgeville and an active Baptist, affirmed this assessment a few years later, writing, quote, in 40 years, the total Negro population of the state has been little more than doubled, while the number of insane has increased 20-fold. No other such rapid and radical change in the mental stability of a race is recorded in history, end quote. So what had caused this increase? In short, Babcock told his audience, freedom was the cause. He argued that emancipation had propelled formerly enslaved African Americans into, quote, a world of mental excitement, end quote, from which slavery had long shielded them. Other white physicians in hospitals for the mentally ill agreed with Babcock's assessment. J.F. Miller, an active member of the Methodist Episcopal Church South and superintendent of the Eastern Hospital in Goldsboro, North Carolina, that like Virginia's Central State housed exclusively Black patients, Miller argued forcefully in a paper read at the 1896 meeting of the Southern Medico-Psychological Association that the rise in insanity and physical degeneration among African Americans was the result of a combination of what he characterized as their mental inferiority and the newly stressful circumstances following emancipation. Now, the mental disturbance late 19th and early 20th century physicians believed Black freedom produced was not uniform, and they elaborated factors that precipitated mental illness in the clash with civilization, as J.D. Roberts, also a physician at the Eastern Hospital, described the state of post-emancipation Black life. And these precipitating factors included such things as heredity, which was usually the highest, the most frequently listed cause, along with sort of unknown, but heredity, senility, injury, alcoholism, and syphilis. And the certainty among medical professionals that along with these, religious excitement was a significant cause of mental illness among African Americans is a striking feature of these accounts. Babcock highlighted what he called agitating novelties in religion as chief among the mental excitements facing African Americans by the turn of the 20th century and contributing to psychological disorder. In his survey of reports from various state hospitals, he found that in a notable percentage of cases, religious excitement was listed as the cause of insanity for Black patients, and other physicians concurred. In 1901, A.B. Richardson, who was superintendent of the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C., which was more commonly known as St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Richardson told the Washington Post that there had been a dramatic increase in the number of patients admitted to the hospital in recent years, noting that, quote, it is true that religious mania is a symptom of many of those admitted. All classes have increased in the same proportion, with the exception of Negroes, they have gained most rapidly. And here you see an example of a diagnosis and description of the supposed cause of insanity for a patient at St. Elizabeth's. Charles King, a North Carolina native, was admitted to the hospital on December 10, 1896, and diagnosed as suffering from chronic mania caused by religious excitement. The hospital's ward notes indicate that King suffered from, quote, occasional attacks of violent excitement, end quote, and that he, quote, imagines that he is God and rules the world, end quote, and that he constantly talked about the Bible and about preaching the gospel. King's condition seems to have improved over time, and he was moved successively into wards at the hospital in which patients received less oversight and were engaged in outdoor labor. His two recorded requests during his confinement were to attend chapel service, as he was, quote, eager to prove that he could behave himself, end quote, and to be able to work outside, both of which he was eventually allowed to do 3 years after his admission to the hospital. He died of coronary disease at the approximate age of 49, 6 years after being committed to St. Elizabeth's. King was like many other black patients in American hospitals for the insane in this period who had likely been born into slavery and struggled financially after emancipation. And he may also have been typical in terms of gender of African Americans diagnosed with religiously grounded mental illness in this period. While I expected to find many more women than men in hospital records, in my preliminary research, men outnumber women slightly, which we can talk about. Now, while King may have been typical of the kind of patient Babcock and other hospital physicians had in mind when discussing race and mental illness at the end of the 19th century, as George Royal's case and many others show, not all African Americans who were admitted to mental institutions in the late 19th century had experienced the transition from slavery to freedom directly. Royal was born in 1865. He grew up in the wake of slavery, amidst the disruption and uncertainties of Reconstruction, the emergence of Jim Crow as well. His parents' experience in slavery certainly shaped his life, and he and his siblings also took advantage of the educational opportunities their parents' generation had created. His brother Octavius, for example, graduated from Howard Law School and became a lawyer in the Midwest. George was released from the hospital, and within 5 years of his commitment had become the principal of the school where he had taught. And in the early 20th century, he left Virginia and took a job as a Pullman porter to make his way north, eventually joining his brother John in the real estate business in Harlem, where he lived until his death. He was involved in Republican Party politics, anti-lynching activism, and became a member of St. Mark's Methodist Episcopal Church. He died in 1934 at the age of 69. Now, that patients like George Royal could not be classified technically among those who had, from the perspective of white psychiatrists, been cushioned by slavery and now suffered the stress of unfitness for freedom mattered little. Medical explanations for the increase in mental illness among African Americans in the period invoked the disruptions of emancipation as the proximate social context, but these explanations were grounded in a broader and more enduring field of racialized beliefs about normal and disordered minds and the relation of religion to these conditions. The attention Babcock and other doctors in such published studies as these gave to the increase in diagnoses of mental illness among African Americans in this period emerged within and contributed to the era's hardening systems of segregation and racial containment that shaped George Royal's young life and Charles King's young adulthood. It was only 1 year after Babcock's 1895 address before the Charities and Correction Conference that the U.S. Supreme Court issued its opinion in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, affirming the legality of racial segregation and broader systems of racial containment. Potential for incarceration in a variety of institutions, including jails, penitentiaries, and almhouses, Almshouses shadowed African Americans in the Jim Crow era, and commitment to mental institutions loomed as another possibility. Indeed, many African Americans were sent to hospitals for the insane from county jails, prisons, and almshouses, which was the case for Charles King, who was transferred from the DC almshouse to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Right? They were transferred there with the determination of criminal agency or mental illness, one or the other, determined through a combination of local, legal, political, and social cultures, as well as the medical standards of the day, with theories about religious causes influencing these. So in the period in which African Americans were forging cultures and communities and freedom, renewing claims to citizenship, in the face of solidifying racial constraints, they came under the scrutiny of psychiatrists, police, and judges who applied racialized ideas about religion and mental health, and they were sometimes consigned to the expanding system of state and local mental institutions. In focusing on African Americans in pursuing these questions, I'm not arguing that they were unique in being diagnosed as suffering from what doctors understood to be religiously grounded mental illness. There's a long history in varied contexts and geographic locations of medical authorities framing individual and group religious expressions as forms of insanity. In the US, diagnoses of individuals as suffering from conditions labeled conditions labeled religious excitement, paranoia, mania, or insanity, or framing of particular forms of religious expression, from those of Quakers to Pentecostals and more, as pathological or deviant, were not by any means limited to people of African descent. Nevertheless, in my preliminary archival work, I see a decrease in the number of diagnoses of religiously grounded mental illness among white patients at the end of the 19th century, and an increase in the number of Black patients admitted to hospitals with such diagnoses. That discourses about race, religion, and mental illness were prominent as physicians raised the alarm about what they saw as a growing social crisis of insanity among African Americans is what interests me. So what is happening in this period, and how do these ideas about race and religion shape the discourse around this idea of social crisis? The growing attention doctors were devoting to the question of mental illness among African Americans also coincided, right at the end of the 19th century, with the transformation of biological psychiatry from a marginal field of medicine to a professionalized one that asserted a distinct disciplinary authority over the definitions of the normal and the insane, with new dimensions emerging in conjunction with late 19th and early 20th century racial science. Several questions motivate me in my current project that's in the early stages of research. One has to do with the nature of the racialized theories of religion that contributed to the professionalization of psychiatry at the turn of the 20th century. I'm interested in the impact of these theories of religion on late 19th and early 20th century African American life, as doctors, law enforcement officials, judges, and educators engaged psychiatric conceptions of the normal American mind and the normal and disordered Black mind. If the claim to shared religious commitment with white Americans was a vital element of the case for Black civic inclusion, as many late 19th and early 20th century Black religious and political leaders argued, what were the implications of psychiatrists' identification of religion as a constituent component of the Black mind? By framing African American religion as excessive, savage, abnormal, psychiatric approaches to race, religion, and mental illness shifted the ground on which many African Americans had staked a claim to inclusion. So examining psychiatric discourse and practice and racialized religious constructions of the normal mind highlights the fraught nature of African Americans' claims to religion as the ground for inclusion in American civic life. In accounting for and responding to what they saw as an emerging medical and social crisis, late 19th and early 20th century psychiatrists produced theories of religion that became constitutive elements of their racialized understandings of the normal and disordered mind. As a precipitating factor for mental illness, this idea of excessive religious excitement, as E.M. Green, who was the clinical director of the Georgia State Sanitarium, characterized African Americans' emotional propensities, excessive religious excitement was not a neutral notion. Like so much about valuations of religion in American culture, interpretations of religious affect, restrained and appropriate or excited and excessive, were often racialized and gendered, as were assessments of theologies and forms of religious organization. How you expressed your religion, what you believed, and in what institutional context you did it were all deeply racialized. Psychiatrists frequently invoked religious beliefs, sensibilities, and practices in their accounts of the hereditary, historical, and social causes of mental instability among African Americans, all of this framed through the lens of white supremacy, of American racial hierarchy, and the doctor's own religious commitments, and most often, as I'm finding, two mainline Protestant denominations, and in some cases with considerable involvements in American church life. So what were the main elements of these racialized theories of religion and mental health? Psychiatrists offered a standard set of explanations for the rise in insanity among African Americans that revolved around the relationship of savagery to civilization and Black people's movement from slavery, during which they supposedly benefited from the custodial care of civilized whites, to freedom, which, absent oversight, became an overwhelming experience. In this framework, African Americans' religious disposition and presumed propensity for emotionalism contributed to the increase in mental illness, and the form of their religious expression in a state of insanity revealed their underlying racialized mental limitations. So it was routine in that all of those published psychiatric works and more, it was routine for these psychiatric practitioners to frame their addresses and publish studies about African Americans and mental health by constructing and rehearsing a trajectory from what they characterized as savagery through enslavement to recent emancipation. St. Elizabeth's Hospital psychiatrist Mary O'Malley, for example, began her study of psychoses among Black patients with the observation that, quote, only 300 years ago, the Negro ancestors of this race were naked dwellers on the west coast of Africa, found by slave traders in the depths of savagery and suddenly transplanted to an environment of the highest civilization, and 250 years later had all the responsibilities of this higher race thrust upon them, end quote. And while many similar accounts, and there are many that begin just like that, X number of generations ago, these accounts mark change over time from Africa to the United States, but psychiatrists routinely insisted on the lack of civilizational development or progress on the part of African Americans. John Lind, who was O'Malley's colleague at St. Elizabeth's, opined in one study, quote, because the Negro wears a Palm Beach suit instead of a string of cowries, carries a gold-headed cane instead of a spear, uses a telephone instead of beating the drum from hill to hill, and for the jungle path has substituted the pay-as-you-enter streetcar, his psychology is no less than the African, end quote. And as with white missionary and political assessments of what historian Catherine Gin Lum calls the historyless heathen, these psychiatric evaluations of African and African American culture emphasize stunted growth because of cultural immaturity deriving from essential race traits, and religion would be one of these elaborated race traits. Another grounding assumption in white medical, religious, and sociological discussions about African Americans and mental illness was that insanity did not exist among Africans in Africa. American neurologist George M. Beard, the son of a Congregationalist minister, who in 1869 described neurasthenia, a disease of nervous exhaustion, built his theory in part on the idea that Africans and Native Americans did not experience mental illness. In his one of his follow-up texts, American Nervousness, he asserted with confidence that, quote, "where there is no civilization, there is no nervousness, no matter what the personal habits may be, even though the experiment be made, as in Africa, for centuries. It would be impossible for an American Indian, by any degree of recklessness or excess, to make himself nervous," end quote. So for Beard and all of these texts, America, 19th century America, is the height of civilization and makes you nervous. The contention that Africans were free of mental illness seldom moved from the level of generalizations drawn from accounts of travelers, usually unnamed, to offers of empirical evidence. Indeed, Beard presented it as the most obvious of facts and not in need of proof, writing, quote, "It is not necessary to read books or travel in order to know that nervous diseases do not exist, or exist but very rarely among savages or semi-savages or even among barbarians," end quote. For these theorists and medical practitioners, the idea that mental illness was largely absent in Africa did not serve as an argument for the hardiness or superiority of African psychology, but simply as a backdrop to explain African Americans' essential unfitness for civilization as typified in American society. Belief that slavery had been a benevolent institution for African Americans' moral, mental, and physical health was another central component of late 19th century white physicians' analyses of the increase in cases of insanity. J.F. Miller of North Carolina's Eastern Hospital summed up the opinion of many white psychiatrists of the beneficial environment of slavery for African Americans' moral and mental well-being, writing, quote, "It is an undisputed fact known to our Southern people that no race of men ever lived under better hygienic restraint or had governing their lives rules or regulations more conducive to physical health and mental repose. Freedom came to him, and a change came over his entire life," end quote. Abraham Whitmer, who was a psychiatrist at St. Elizabeth's, argued in an 1891 assessment of titled Insanity in the Colored Race in the United States that, quote, "previous to emancipation, the health and morals of slaves were carefully preserved. Since their liberation, through overindulgence, exposure, and ignorance to the laws of health, many have suffered from the effects of these fruitful causes of insanity," end quote. And Whitmer, like many other white physicians, highlighted the connection between deteriorating physical conditions in freedom, poverty, unhealthy living conditions, and disease, and the rise in mental disorders, whereas these conditions could have been addressed through education, economic opportunity. Whitmer turned, as did so many others, to much more common arguments about innate racialized mental and emotional capacity as shaping the response of African Americans to the disciplining benefits of slavery and the problems of the absence of that. He wrote, quote, "Untutored in a knowledge of the world and without a sound philosophy or a religion deeper seated than the emotions to sustain them in adversity, many minds have failed under the constant strain of their advancing civilization," end quote. In their reflections on mental illness among African Americans, early 20th century psychiatrists theorized about the relative influence of what they understood to be ancient human patterns, innate Black racial traits, and contemporary African American experience. And here is where discussions of religion often came to the fore in the invocation of imagined characteristics of Black religious beliefs, practices, and experiences. Throughout this literature, ideas about the propensity for superstitious belief as a racial trait featured prominently, as in St. Elizabeth's hospitals psychiatrist William Bevis's 1921 assertion that, quote, nothing in the life of the Negro stands out more prominently than his superstition. It influences his thought and conduct more than anything else. In no other trait or peculiarity do we find more plainly the imprint of the primitive African life and customs, end quote. African superstitions, as manifest in African American life, these psychiatrists argued, were all-consuming and tyrannical. E.M. Green, who was the clinical director of the Georgia State Sanitarium, argued in 1914 that, quote, from the cradle, the Negro lives in the fear of the supernatural. As an infant, he is threatened with beasts, spooks, and witches. In childhood, the chief subjects of conversation which he overhears are witchcraft, spells, ghosts, and conjuring. Every sickness is attributed to the agency of poison, every misfortune to that of witchcraft. The life of the Negro is made up of invoking the aid of such agencies and of guarding against such efforts on the part of others, end quote. In addition to the idea that African Americans experienced a kind of mental tyranny because of their imagined racial propensity for superstitious beliefs and the failure to relegate religion to a limited arena of life, psychiatric assessments of the state of African American mental health generally presented emotional and spiritual excess as opposed to moral or ethical concern as the substance of Black religious expression. E.M. Green again concluded that, quote, the Negro's religious convictions are most superficial, and while a great churchgoer, easily swayed by religious oratory and capable of excessive religious excitement, he has no realization of the basic principles of religion and gives way to all kinds of moral derelictions while professing the deepest piety, end quote. Some psychiatrists theorize that the combination of a lack of practical morals and the emotional draw of religious excitement could precipitate mental illness, particularly as the result of religious experience in group settings. Mary O'Malley wrote that, quote, under the influence of emotional excitements of any description, as religion, witchcraft, etc., an assemblage of colored people can work themselves to a degree of mental exaltation where the real world disappears from sight and the supernatural alone exists for them, end quote. Now, such assessments by white observers of the nature of African and African diaspora religion, primitive, superstitious, emotional, contagious, lacking in ethics and morals, are no doubt familiar and can be found in literature before the era of the professionalization of psychiatry and in a range of social, scientific, and theological literature. But something else is at stake, however, when such racialized theories of religion become part of a medical specialty that has the capacity to link long-standing racialized views of deviant culture and religion to biological conceptions of the normal mind. The racialized biologizing of mental normalcy and deviance in early American psychiatry became solidified in the transition in the 1910s and 1920s from the older diagnostic categories of mania and melancholy, as you saw in Charles King's paperwork, with religious excitement, as in his case again, sometimes listed as a precipitating factor or underlying cause. So the transition from these kinds of categories to dementia praecox, literally premature dementia, solidified again this racialized biologizing of mental normalcy and deviance. So dementia praecox came into widespread use in diagnosis of mental illness in the United States through the work of German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who theorized this psychosis as deriving from underlying metabolic functions common to all humans. As embraced by American psychiatrists, however, race became an important factor in its application. As historian of psychiatry Jonathan Metzl writes, quote, the Kraepelian emphasis on brain biology fit easily into existing beliefs that Negroes were biologically unfit for freedom, end quote. And psychiatrists like E.M. Green argued that there was a higher incidence of dementia praecox among African Americans, in part because of their primitive religious dispositions and lack of moral grounding. And again, in my preliminary archival work, I see this increase in these mania, melancholia with religious excitement among Black patients in these admissions registers, and then by around 1910, those disappear, and dementia praecox, usually with sort of unknown cause in the admissions register, so it requires a lot more work in the files to figure out when religion is a factor. But I want to follow up on Metzel's insistence that it really just kind of solidifies all of these earlier racialized ideas of culture and religion into biology. So when St. Elizabeth's psychiatrist and active Methodist Ara Evarts turned her attention in the 1910s to research on dementia praecox among African Americans, she highlighted the history of religions as the interpretive key for treating Black patients. Evarts relied heavily on James G. Fraser's The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, to argue for the importance of recognizing both phylogenetic evolutionary inheritances, for her seen most clearly in remnants of shared human religious expressions, and ontogenetic influences, the actual memory of individuals, in assessing psychoses of the colored race. According to Evarts, Black and white patients were not entirely distinct in terms of the phylogenetic or evolutionary elements of their manifestations of dementia praecox. She gave the example of a white male patient at St. Elizabeth's who, quote, who she described as out of touch with reality, who, quote, has the mannerism of standing with head bowed and hands folded in a devotional attitude, end quote. And she described him as having a jerking, shuffling walk. She concluded that although he was unaware of what he was doing, quote, we can scarce avoid the conclusion that it is a fragment of a religious ritual, end quote. She described a Black female patient, similarly detached from reality, who, quote, bends slightly backward with chest elevated and assumes a facial expression intended to be terrifying, end quote. The woman she described as spitting, snorting, stamping her feet, waving her skirt, all the while producing terrifying grimaces. This, Evarts determined, using Fraser as a guide, was also a phylogenetic parallel of ancient rituals and ceremonies among, quote, savages meant to scare away demons, end quote. But where she saw the white man's manifestation as incomplete, fragmentary, and only suggestive of ancient rituals, she insisted that the Black woman's was much more recognizable and complete because, quote, the colored race is so much nearer its stage of barbarism, end quote. Evarts asserted that the prominence of what she called hoodoos, conjures, and spells in Black culture established that insanity among Blacks was the product both of ancient inheritances, like the ritual she was calling on before, and the fact that, quote, this primitive method of thought was an integral part of the race, end quote, and expressed in what she said was the actual beliefs and practices of their everyday lives. And again, her reading of Fraser on talismans, spells, contagious magic, and sorcery only confirmed this assessment. It's not uncommon in the records of commitment hearings to find African Americans attributing mental disturbance to the effects of conjure or hoodoo. When 21-year-old Mary Judah was brought from the Richmond County, Virginia jail to stand before justices of the peace in 1885 for a determination on her sanity, the examining physician reported that religious excitement was the supposed cause of her insanity and that she complained, quote, of being tricked or conjured, end quote. Judah had been charged with disorderly conduct in at least 2 cases prior to this arrest, so she was, there are newspaper accounts of her arguing with a man in the street or using foul language. In the case of her 1885 arrest, it's possible that her admission of belief in conjure was what led to her being declared a lunatic and committed to the Central State Asylum. No family members appear to have been involved in the commitment proceedings, and the only testimony offered came from a white physician who found her discussion of being conjured sufficient evidence of insanity. Most white physicians who published articles and delivered addresses about African American mental health in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were associated with one of the many state hospitals for the insane. For her part, Evart's platform as an assistant physician at St. Elizabeth's, the government hospital for the insane, a standard-setting teaching hospital, made her work quite influential, as was the case for her colleagues at St. Elizabeth's, and a number of them published studies of insanity among African Americans with attention to religion, and was the case for physicians at state hospitals who contributed their assessments of the relationship of religion to Black mental health to the published psychiatric literature. As such, the frameworks they developed offering medical evidence for the purported connections among what they characterized as African savagery, African and African American unfitness for civilization and freedom, propensity for superstitious belief, and overly emotional religious practice and insanity, this framework became authoritative and influential. There were few Black physicians specializing in psychiatry in this early period to weigh in on these issues. Constantine Clinton Barnett, a graduate of Howard University Medical School, the son of a prominent Baptist pastor in Huntington, West Virginia, and a first cousin to the historian Carter G. Woodson, was unusual in that he developed a specialty in psychiatry, and he had charge of a state mental institution. In 1926, Barnett became the first superintendent of West Virginia's Lakin State Hospital for the Colored Insane, and his wife, Clara Matthews Barnett, a nurse, became the hospital's matron. Here's a picture of the early staff. Barnett believed that the study of, quote, religion, mythology, magic, and sociology, end quote, was vital for psychiatrists. He wrote in the 1932 Lakin State Annual Report that, quote, the physician often uncovers the clue to the patient's difficulty by virtue of his knowledge of the tenets of some religious cult or mythical practice. Modes of thought in our patient may not seem so strange or unintelligible when we discover that his belief or ritual, at this time quite unusual to us, was indulged or practiced widely many years ago by his primitive brother. A custom in one part of the country in a certain cultural level may be considered quite proper, whereas in another part and in a different cultural level may suggest a mental disorder, end quote. So in some ways, his views on the relationship of religion to the manifestation of mental illness among his patients bore some relationship to theories put forth by white psychiatrists in the decades before he began his work at Lakin. But Barnett argued for consideration of culture rather than racial traits, albeit in the context of an implicit cultural and religious hierarchy, perhaps a geographic one as well. And his career really emphasized treatment in an institution that he thought should not be, quote, merely a hospital for custodial care, end quote. But I'm interested he doesn't seem to have left any papers, so I'm interested in figuring out more about, again, both his theories and the relationship to practice at his hospital. In 1898, just a few years after Babcock delivered his address about the alarming rise in cases of insanity among African Americans, 45-year-old James Duffin was admitted to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, diagnosed as suffering from chronic mania caused by religious excitement. Duffin had been arrested at Washington, D.C.'s Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church for assaulting a man newspaper accounts say he mistook for the devil. He was brought before the Equity Court a few days later for a lunacy inquisition, and the judge declared him insane and directed that he be committed. While Duffin was in the hospital, his wife Lizzie cared for their young daughter and worked as a seamstress to support them. Duffin's file, as preserved in the National Archives, is unusually detailed when compared with those of other Black indigent patients at St. Elizabeth's in this period, and contains not only the standard admissions paperwork and ward notes, but also a photograph, and these photographs I'm showing you are very unusual in the Black patients' records, and correspondence between James and Lizzie, where Pinckney Royal implored the institution to take his son George, Lizzie pleaded to have her husband released. According to the ward notes, James worked in the hospital's tailor shop, went to the chapel every Sunday, and was generally agreeable. He got into conflicts with other patients on occasion, once when one interrupted his morning prayers. Lizzie desperately wanted her husband released, writing to his doctor several times and expressing her deep loneliness without James, and her sense from her visits with him that he was much improved. James, too, missed Lizzie, and he wrote a letter to her expressing joy at a recent visit with her and their daughter, telling of his sadness at the thought that they might not be reunited, and consoling her that he was improving and thought that he might not have any more spells. That the letter remains in the file is perhaps an indication that the hospital never sent it to Lizzie. His doctor wrote a note on the back of one of Lizzie's letters from 1897 that, quote, "The sending of this man home has always resulted in an attack of maniacal excitement, and once in nearly a homicide," end quote. The ward notes from some years later give no indication of such trouble, with James visiting home every few months in the year prior to his discharge in 1903 and 3 years before his death in 1906. There's so much we cannot know about what sits in the spaces between the fact of James's violence, Lizzie's and James's beliefs about his mental health, and his doctor's evaluations of his sanity. But I'm interested in trying to understand what role racialized psychiatric theories about African American religions played in the treatment and experience of thousands of African Americans like James in courts, jails, and hospitals, in the press and popular culture, and in Black family life and church life in the late 19th and early 20th century United States. And so I look forward to questions, comments, and help. Thank you.
Disturbing, but remarkable the way you managed to bring to life so many people who, in the very creation of these records, their humanity was, denied. So thank you for this study. If you have any questions.
Adam has a question.
What is the prescription, aside from, people need to be in the hospital, or is there any kind of prescription aside from that this is, they're racializing it, which is just a fixed thing? Like what, in their science?
In their science.
Yeah. How is this fixed according to them? And then also this is related in that their concern, it reminded me of, and this is just in my own haphazard reading, it reminded me of the concern about social integration in 1890s, early 20th century in, for example, like European socialist thought, the anxieties around Jews within socialism, and that there's some problem of the social body falling apart. And then you can see this also, say, in Durkheim with in the study of suicide, that whole thing of social amity. So maybe to connect it to that it's the same. I mean, it's different in that these European thinkers, whether the anti-Semite ones or Durkheim, are concerned about social integration, whereas in this case it's about keeping some kind of control of someone on top. But maybe there's some kind of parallel, because they're both about things falling apart with the freedom of emancipation or the freedom of modernity for say, like Durkheim.
You're the second person to mention Durkheim suicide is something I need to think about. Their prescription is labor and segregation. One of the, I can't remember which hospital he was in. I want to say Alabama. So I spent a lot of time with really racist texts now. And I read this one, I thought, wow, this is in a league of its own. He's very clear about, he's the medical director of one of the state hospitals. It is just simply, we must resist any idea of the possibility of social equality. They must be segregated, contained, the vote must be kept, these are things obviously lots of people are arguing, but in this context it actually is literally a medical prescription that to allow Black people to experience the anxieties that proximity to higher civilization necessarily will produce is dangerous. We'll just end up with more and more and more of this. So limiting social development is the prescription. I think I don't have a very clear sense of how that changes by the time dementia praecox comes in. There is more science as they talk about, as they adopt that new terminology and diagnostic categories. I think, so I don't have a clear sense of that. I feel like Everarts is someone who's really struggling with how to bridge the new science of Krappelin's diagnostic categories with older ideas, and that Fraser becomes some kind of bridge for that. So she's really the main person who turns to that kind of literature that I found so far. But I don't have a good sense of what her idea of the prescription is. So by the time Barnett comes in and he's talking about that this institution is not going to be one just of custodial care, again, labor within the institutions is the prescription to restore people to mental health, and then there are kind of larger sociological ideas about how to prevent. So on the individual level, labor, and then also on the social level. If that helps.
Thank you for a talk, and I have to say the images are just so haunting and make me really exciting research. So this doesn't come completely out of left field, but I don't know if you're aware of the work that Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson did on dementia praecox, but they in the 30s went up to Holland because they were so
Oh, yes.
There was like this whole preoccupation in the early 20th century about the rise in dementia praecox,
Right.
which basically was called schizophrenia now. And so they had this
Right.
notion building off Benedict's work that there are places where people go into trance-like states in ways that are considered normal. So they went to Bali, and so of course it was all governed under the idea of Balinese religion, and to look at the actual way in which disassociative states are nurtured, anyway, so it's just like because it was so racialized and weirdly projected, and Margaret Mead, if you read between the lines, she just totally did not like all these women in particular. So it's just very, and just sort of building, I don't know what's going, you're stopping a little earlier than that, just in this talk at least, so.
Yeah.
But the way that gets further scientized and then sort of picked up as a racial culturally, like, who are these people who can go into these kinds of states so easily, which, so I don't know exactly, it seems to me that's being racialized in a sort of neighborly way here, but also with such sinister political consequences. So anyway, I just...
Well, just two thoughts about that. Thank you. Right now, perhaps to the detriment of the project, I don't know, I'm really focused on psychiatry as a profession. A lot of people have told me to broaden, to think about.
They were all in conversation with all these psychiatrists.
Yeah.
I mean, and they were trying to show that, like, schizoid states could actually be explained. They weren't rejecting psychiatry,
Right.
they were also saying you have this
Through cultural. No, so it's another encouragement to not limit myself only to this literature that I'm finding. And the other is that as I am picturing the project, it will probably go through the late 1930s. I'm interested in so I stumbled on this idea from the previous project in looking at published psychiatric literature about followers of Father Divine and their states, psychotic states. And so that's like mid-1930s to late 1930s. Psychiatrists in Bellevue and are writing about that. And so thinking I think there's some change, there's some sense early in this literature, and I had some quotations about this Mary O'Malley, although she goes a little bit later. There's some interest in the group state, but a lot of these psychiatrists are really focused on the individual and race traits. I think over time there might be more attention to that kind of, to community and culture, and so to put the literature you're suggesting in conversation with how psychiatrists are talking about these new religious movements in the early 20th century North, I think might be really helpful too. So, as I think of it, I'm going from 1880-ish to 1940 or so. I don't know.
Well, I guess what made me think of that is just like, how often do you run into dementia precox? Like, what's really how to pronounce it?
It's everywhere, trust me. Now it's everywhere.
But also because the provocative things you were reading were teetering between culturalist and evolutionary and
Yeah.
racial explanations.
Right.
And so I don't know, that was to me, it was just very provoking that it was both psychiatric and, it just sounded like it was not allowing them to just be individuals, they had to be racialized and match this cultural subjects with proclivities.
Not to give their idea of labor as a prescription, speaking geography-wise, were there less instances of people being institutionalized, say, in New York or the Northeast, where there were more opportunities for work, as opposed to in the South, where the industry was shifting?
So these early psychiatrists, I should say actually that 1890 census that is key for all of their projections about the increase in mental illness, first of all, was lost in a fire, so we don't have access to that anymore. I sit around and I think, if only I had the 1890 census. So many things. It was actually crucial for my migration stuff, so I lost a critical decade in tracking people. But there's a small counter literature saying the census itself was flawed, and so any numbers that would be drawn from it were problematic. So that's one thing to say. But so all these guys come down on the 1890 census, and they say, we got this huge increase in insanity. Both we can see it in the census, we can see it in our institutions, and we also know that the North is like way ahead of us. There's so many more insane black people. Like the proportion of black insanity in the North is so much higher because they have been in freedom longer and we're just getting there. So we can see what's going to happen. I mean, those numbers are disputed. There's just not the kind of institutionalization that happens. I mean, I'm really interested in the people coming out of slavery, and we see the expanding carceral state through forms of labor and imprisonment, and just kind of thinking about this arena as adjacent to all of those. So they use the North, they use this image, unsubstantiated, of like rampant black insanity to justify things that are going on. Another area I'm interested in, I don't know if I can really follow it out, it was a kind of comparative one as well. It's very hard to get access to records in the North. Northern states' HIPAA rules so far have stymied me. Yes. In the state of New Jersey, you can see nothing. And fortunately, the state of New Jersey is not a good case for me. But New York State, no. California, so I've tracked some, so the hospital admissions registers for California state hospitals are online on Ancestry.com, which is crazy. I gotta stop saying crazy. And there I see, migration mostly from Texas and Louisiana, and people are, so I'm interested in thinking about a very different kind of cultural context in which there are lots of Asian Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans in the hospitals, along with whites as well. All the other stuff I have is just black, overwhelmingly black and white. And just thinking about what that context might reveal about some aspects of theory and treatment. That was one other thing I was going to say about California. Also, it's another case along with Virginia and North Carolina where there was a high degree of sterilization going on. So the regional question is interesting. Right now, what I have to say is that these Southern doctors who produce all of this literature use the idea of the North as a foil more than anything. Oh, she's in charge.
Sorry.
Okay, so you mentioned the religious affiliation of several of these white psychiatrists,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. So it certainly implies that there's not across the board hostility to religion, but I'm wondering if there's something else going on in sort of mainline white religious experience that is helping them pathologize the African American experience.
Thank you for noticing that.
Sort of hints at that.
So lots of people have worked on these same doctors and on this same stuff. So this, this account I'm giving is not entirely original. Most people haven't really thought about how religion factored in. And the thing I've never seen is any discussion of any of the biographies of these doctors who are formulating these theories. And so J.F. Miller from the Eastern Hospital grew up as a son of a slaveholder on a plantation. These kinds of things I think are interesting and important. And I am interested in and another way that the other scholars have talked about some of the stuff is that these are scientists of whatever kind of science, and they're pathologizing religion, and most of these people, to the extent that I've been able to find out, are very involved in their religious communities. And so I don't have an answer about any one thing that's going on in mainline Protestantism. Obviously, there's religion and there's this other stuff that their patients are doing. Some of the admissions registers in the hospitals, most of them actually record the religious affiliations of the patients as well, denominational affiliations. So I don't have a good answer except to say I am interested. I put that in. I think it's important that R.F. was an active contributor to the Methodist Women's Missionary Society. How much more I can flesh out these things about the individuals. I'm working on it. But their obituaries, their professional obituaries, go on at great length, actually, about their religious commitments and how much God was, the author of their career and these sorts of things. So even it's making me think, the more I'm digging these up, about how early psychiatry, I could say this about various other forms of medicine, I mean, these people had commitments that really shaped what they did. So it's on the, I spent a lot of time rooting around in old family histories and things to come up with their denominational affiliations or figuring out where they're buried and things like that. So it's not a good answer, but yeah.
I was going to say something maybe about Sigmund Freud and his theories and how they apply to the African American experience, and maybe, of course, it was an outside of the Protestant religion and things like that. Maybe as an outside, how he was looking at it as some of these type of issues.
I missed the beginning of it.
Sigmund Freud.
Oh. Where's Anne Pellegrini? I'll turn it over to to Leanne. Freud doesn't come up in anything I've read so far. Yeah. Freud has not been a presence.
Could I? Sorry, I don't want to be my position.
But I don't want to dismiss it. It's not something that and this is my other thing of I'm on these medical psychiatrists in these state hospitals right now. I expected over time to see more discussion of Freud, maybe a little bit later in some of the literature on the new religious movements, on the cult leaders and cult mania, and the ways that there's a lot of discussion in some of that literature on the kind of sexual frenzy that cult leaders put their followers into. And so I think that's a place to think about when they invoked Freud or not, but.
Just in relation to that, so much of Freud, I was thinking about Freud actually throughout the talk because he's responding to this and it's actually, your material makes you appreciate Freud so much more. So, for example, the whole thing about phylogenesis.
Yeah.
And because he's taking that from Fraser as well, but then he does something different with it.
Yeah.
He de-racializes it.
All right, I got to go back to Freud then. Were you going to ask something?
I was, but I shouldn't abuse my position here. So,
I was actually curious if there were any parallel diagnostic terms that developed for white religious mania. Because I'm thinking of, at a certain period, at least the stuff that I know, there began being a class divide about who was diagnosed with hysteria and who was neurosemantic. And I was wondering if there's an acceptable white Christian form of
Religious
mania
excitement,
that
yeah.
works its way into the records.
I don't find different, I think I have to think about that. I don't find different terminology. So there's almost universal, I took that card out. Belief on the part of the psychiatrists, and another component that I didn't talk about is that Black people don't have melancholy. simple to get sad. Happy-go-lucky Negroes don't ever get sad. And there's a lot of scientific literature about that. And so there's the occasional. So in that sense, a diagnosis like chronic mania with religious excitement, so this one would be very common for black people. It would be not uncommon at all for whites. But chronic melancholia caused by religious something would be much more common for whites. The terms are the same. Yeah, that's the main difference I see. Although, even though I find lots of literature saying there's no melancholy. Occasionally it's in there. And it was almost all, again, I thought, you've heard me say this, I thought I was going to find this going to be all about women, and it's not at all. I mean, I have some statistics in the government hospital for the insane. It's something like, in the couple, 600 cases I looked at, it's like 58% men, and the men are more likely to have melancholy for things like bereavement and I don't know. So.
Did you want to follow? Well, maybe, and perhaps the reason why there's less for women is that once slavery ended, they took on jobs that were not that unlike what they were already doing. So doing laundry, working at a person's home, maybe their level of freedom wasn't quite as drastic, like gained quickly as with the men.
And exposure to public culture and whatever. I don't know how much I can do, but the kind of the kind of surveillance of, I guess it could happen in the home, but out in various kinds of professions, that would lead you to being suspected of lunacy.
And our women just given a lot more leeway because they're so emotional and weak to begin with, to have sort of spells and religious excitement.
It's possible. It's possible. And in the Virginia materials I looked at that are commitment hearing paperwork, there's not, they didn't save the hospital records, but so they're very kind of brief sentences that'll be like religion and too much study, religion and menstrual problems, religion and postpartum depression, religion and whatever. So bereavement. There's a lot of religion and things that are things about women's bodies there.
Yes.
You briefly mentioned Father Divine. I was wondering whether you could expand on that.
I could expand on Father Divine for a year. Anything in particular?
In relation
To this, yeah. For those who may not know, Father Divine was a religious leader who had his headquarters in New York in the 1930s. The movement was quite large in the 1930s and into the 1940s, the Peace Mission movement. It was organized around the idea that he was God in a physical body, and that with his coming to earth in physical form, he ushered in the kingdom of God, and so he gathered these followers. It was an interracial movement, but overwhelmingly, but predominantly black and female, of migrants from the South and immigrants from the Caribbean, and they saw themselves living in the kingdom of God. They lived celibate, sex-segregated lives. They believed they wouldn't get sick or die. And in order to join the kingdom, you had to cut off family ties and see yourself only as God's child. And they took spiritual names that were fanciful. And the family court judge in New York, whose name escapes me right now, hated Father Divine, hated him, and cases would come before him of spousal abandonment, of child abandonment, because people were just leaving their families and going into these communal residences. And Judge Pankin was his name. And he often sent, especially women who had left their children, sent them to Bellevue for assessment. And Loretta Bender, who was one of the psychiatrists there, who I found out from looking in her papers was a friend of Judge Pankin's, she published some studies of psychoses among followers of Father Divine, behavior problems of children, followers of Father Divine, and then some of them would be sent on to the state hospitals, and Pilgrim State Hospital in Long Island was the largest hospital in the world, I think, when it opened, and one of the psychiatrists there as well published some work about psychoses among Father Divine's followers. So this is how I got into this. So these studies that are very detailed, focused case studies of individuals and are nested in ideas about cult leaders and cults, and then nested in the same kind of 3 generations ago, the Negro was a savage in Africa. That part really, that's what I started pulling the thread on. That really surprised me, that there were ideas about cults and the sway of charismatic leaders, and then in this particular case, but that it was wrapped in this, by 1936, this larger package really surprised me when I was doing that research for that book. So it was kind of universally believed among public officials that Father Divine himself was crazy. He was tried for lunacy in Georgia. But at a certain point, they were much more interested in what the psychology of the followers was like. And again, a lot of it was about a kind of charismatic sex appeal and things like that. So there are these published studies that are really fascinating.
Yeah, final question. I think we, okay, go right ahead.
Yeah.
Over there? We'll have one this, and do you want to, yes, okay. 2 more questions.
I'm wondering if thus far in your research you've come across any sort of religious prescriptions, either built into the labor and the space of these institutions, in ways to sort of retrain people to be religiously appropriate.
Yeah.
That might be interesting
Yeah.
to look at in light of the physicians, the psychiatrists' religious beliefs. Sort of religion being prescribed appropriate, what they would consider appropriate.
Yeah, that's a very helpful reminder. All of these state mental institutions had chapels. And as we see from some of the ward notes, it's a privilege to, in St. Elizabeth's, to be allowed to go to chapel. St. Elizabeth's had from what I haven't gotten into this stuff this material quite yet, but that had a kind of fleet of chaplains, kind of like other institutions where it seemed to have been segmented by denomination, and whereas the South Carolina State Hospital, for example, had a chaplain, a guy who spent like 25 years being the chaplain. And I've been reading through the annual reports there, and it's unusual in that hospital. There's a chaplain's report as part of the report, and I was supposed to go to that archive, but the hurricane came. So it's on my agenda to see if there are more chaplain's files. His report is like, it's the same report every year. Like, I had chapel service. I visited people, and it's very sympathetic in a general way. And he does sometimes say, like, both colored and white patients came, but he's saying, God has mercy on these sufferers, and I was pleased to have so many people. But I want to get a little bit more texture. They're distributing religious literature. There is a sense that that's a good thing for them to go. I think in some of the hospitals, it's I do have some occasional statements that this actually is our goal, that to bring Christian civilization to these sufferers. So, yeah, it's definitely something I want to get into more.
Yeah, thanks so much for such a great portrait of a really important thread in this story. I never really encountered the segregated asylums prior. I'm really curious, maybe it wasn't central to the work, to what extent you might have encountered more about the treatment of these patients. I know it was a period where there were incredibly violent treatments, across all asylums, whether
Yeah.
ice baths or swaddling or stress postures, etc. Was there an attitude of experimentation, or that it would even apply from one case to another? Or I'm curious on that. And then sort of a follow up. I know you mentioned that work was probably going to only extend through the late 30s, but you mentioned Jonathan Metzl, and I'm wondering if you want to explicitly connect this with the president. For example, ways in which the same behavioral condition might be interpreted as attention deficit disorder in one case, and oppositional compliance disorder in another, and some of those through lines to the president.
Yeah. On that, how I might do that it's still too early to tell, but it is certainly it's with me as I'm working on this material. I mean, Metzl's work is really fascinating, and I don't want to presume any kind of through line yet, because I still don't know enough. In terms of, but I'll take any other suggestions. In terms of treatment, what I see so far is, well, first of all, very badly kept records for Black patients, which makes it hard. But their treatments are similar, again, depending on diagnosis. So lots of St. Elizabeth's, their treatments are similar, except that labor is really the thing that Black people get sent to do more than anything. Then at St. Elizabeth's, they have these, the baths they're doing, cold bath treatment, cold water and cold swaddling. I was looking at a photograph of that the other day. And in the annual reports, they're saying things like, well, we need more money to build a wing so that colored women can be given this hydrotherapy, for example. So there's always a lag in terms of access to treatment, which may have been a good thing for the Black patients. By the 30s, maybe early 40s, they're doing insulin overdose treatment for these dementia praecox patients. And very sadly, although this is after my period, one of the hospitals, forget his name now, the famed lobotomist who lobotomized the Kennedy daughter, Lakin is where he spends a lot of time practicing on Black patients. So there's either the lag in getting whatever the state-of-the-art treatment is, or as you say, they're first to get the bad. Right, they're experimented on to perfect something that's going to be bad. Anyway, how this relates to the particular diagnosis is something that it's still not entirely clear to me. I mean, this is where I am right now, I have all of this literature, something was happening about religion. I have all of these cases, they're all being labeled religious something. How to figure out how both of those things made a difference in the hospitals is something that I am now trying to get to some more hospital records. I just haven't seen enough of it in the ones I've seen so far.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.